Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to all of our friends from around the world to the third International Fortepiano Salon hosted by the Academy of Fortepiano Performance and the Catskill Mountain Foundation. My name is Yiheng Yang and I'm speaking to you from Holmdel, New Jersey. I'm a forte pianist and I teach at the Juilliard School. And it's my great pleasure with my co-host Maria Rose, who is in upstate New York, to welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's Salon is entitled Beethoven According to Moscheles, Legato Playing, Pedaling, and Piano. And we have a wonderful program co-hosted by Pierre Goy, who is in Switzerland and live streaming with us with his students from the Geneva and Lausanne conservatories. After Pierre's presentation with his students, they'll explore playing Beethoven on early pianos and looking at the point of view of Ignaz Moscheles in his editions. We'll be joined by an incredible panel of some of the leading experts in the field of interpretation and early pianos. We have Sandra Rosenblum from Boston, who's wrote the watershed book on interpretation and early pianos called Performance Practices in Classic Piano Music, Their Principles and Applications. We also have with us David Brightman from Oberlin University, who has just come out with a new book called Piano Playing Revisited, What Modern Players Can Learn from Period Instruments. And finally, we have from England, David Rowland, who, amongst other books, has written the indispensable History of Pianoforte Pedaling from Cambridge University Press. So it's going to be a wonderful, lively, and extremely informative time together. After the presentation by Pierre and our Q&A with the panelists, we also invite you to come and socialize with us in a Zoom reception. And all you have to do there is to click a Zoom link, which will be provided in the chat box towards the end of the program. And you can say hello to friends from previous salons as well as new friends that we're meeting today. So all I ask of you now is to enjoy the program and also to type in your name and where you're from in the chat box and what you do in music. This is our way of seeing who's tuning in from around the world. In our previous salons, we've had people truly from all points of the globe, and you may find people that you know already. So please type your name in the Facebook and YouTube chat box and say where you're from. And now I'd like to turn the mic over, so to speak, to my co-host, Maria Rose, who works at RILM and is a wonderful musicologist and forte pianist, and my co-director at the Academy of Fortepiano Performance. Maria?
Thank you, Yi-Heng, for this wonderful introduction. And usually I try to begin the salons that we've had by saying how wonderful it is that we can bring the audiences to the pianos instead of having to bring the pianos to the audiences. But I'm afraid today I was reminded that this is not a completely natural way of doing things, because there was a tree that fell on my power line 2 hours ago, and I was completely without power and helpless until about an hour ago. So I'm extra glad to be here. And so my name is Maria Rose, and I'm also a forte pianist. And it is my, we have a really interesting program, as Yi-Heng outlined. I would like to add that there will be some information to access on your, there will be some extra documents that you can click on, that you can, links will be provided also of the, we will try to tell you exactly who's playing what during the video. So we're hoping to give as much extra information as we can, because this time we really are going to look at the work of forte pianists, what it is that we do behind the scenes before we go on stage and play on these instruments, the questions we ask and how we deal with them. And it's really a wonderful opportunity to see this kind of growing knowledge that Pierre has fostered among his students, and that we get to hear them in person and how they are changing their point of view and what it means to them. So I'm going to introduce Pierre Goy, who is in Geneva at a very, very special place, which he will talk about in a minute for a little bit in a collection. And we met him when he first came to the workshop 3 years ago, I think, or maybe almost 4 years ago. He gave a wonderful masterclass and concert and masterclass and played Chopin on the original Pleyel. Pierre's a pianist of incredible range, because on the other hand, what you heard in the introduction was his brand new recording of C.P. Bach, which is I can really highly recommend to everyone. It's produced by Claves in Switzerland, and it has works by C.P. Bach on 4 different instruments, and a clavichord, a square piano, a tangenten piano or a pantalon, and a full-grown piano by Silbermann, Henri Silbermann. And one of the things that I think you might have noticed is the incredible open kind of sound that the instrument, it was the pantalon that we played during the introduction, and it's a good introduction to what we're going to be talking about today, because it's the kind of sound that 18th century people would be very familiar with, and we're now more used to hearing very clean and well pedaled sounds. And so this is a whole different world that we are entering. And now I would like to hand it over to Pierre. Welcome, Pierre.
Welcome, Pierre.
Thank you, Maria Rose, and thank you, Yihan, for your invitation. And it's a great pleasure for all the students and my colleague and I to take part to the International Fortepiano Salon series. And also, I want to give a special thanks to Pam Weisberg and the Catskill Mountain Foundation for sponsoring these events and let this possible. We are very pleased and honored to be able to discuss the research project Beethoven according to Moscheles, legato playing, piano pedaling, and traditions in the early 19th century. A project carried out within the framework of research at the Haute École EMU Vaud-Vallée-Fribourg and HEM Geneva, with our interlocutors this evening, whom I would like to greet. The Fondation de la Ménestrandie, where we are today with all the students and where we worked for this research project, is part of the history of the revival of early music. Born in 1898, its founder, Hélène Tesser-Vuillemier, a violinist, very gifted, met Wanda Landowska, the great pianist and harpsichordist, in 1931. This meeting was to determine the next stage of her career, which would be devoted to early music. She built up a collection of early instruments and copied a large quantity of music from public libraries around the world. In 1935, she founded an ensemble called La Ménestrandie, musique et instruments anciens. From 1949 onwards, Hélène Tesser-Vuillemier collaborated with Radio Genève, where she directed the early music department. Now, the research project. The use of the pedal in Beethoven's sonatas raises questions. Very few pedal indications have been written by Beethoven. However, we know from Czerny, especially from the fourth supplement of his method, Opus 500, that Beethoven used the pedal much more often. In 1858, Ignaz Moscheles published Beethoven's sonatas for the second time. In the preface, he indicates that he wishes to pass on the performance instructions, especially those concerning the pedal. The pianist who attempts to implement the performance instructions, including those for the pedal, given by Moscheles in his Hallberger edition, soon realizes that large passages should be played without any pedal assistance, which requires a formidable digital precision. If at the beginning the subject of the research seemed to focus on the use of the pedal, the other side of the coin soon became as important, if not more so, namely the practice of legato playing. And I would like to thank Joachim Marville, colleague, a magnificent musician, harpsichordist, pianofortist, and clavicordist. So she has a complete overview of the practice of keyboard instruments in the 18th century, but also beginning and going inside the 19th century. And she has enabled us to understand the continuity of this practice, which continued uninterrupted into the 19th century. On the other hand, Moscheles sometimes gives pedal indications that include an appoggiatura and its resolution, creating mixtures that are no longer accepted today. In other places, he creates very daring mixtures, unthinkable for a modern pianist. The questions that the Moscheles project aims to answer are the following. Can Moscheles indications be used for the performance of the Beethoven sonata? Can they be performed only on period instruments or also on a modern instrument? What are the playing techniques from Beethoven's time we have to be redeveloped in order to be able to perform these pedals indications faithfully? Can we define rules for the use of the pedal in Beethoven's time by analyzing the Hallberger edition of Moscheles? Now, how we did this research, how we worked. From January to September to 2020, we worked every month, 2 days per month. The work was carried out in groups, not at all like a teaching, but in an interactive way. The students who participated in the project studied modern piano, fortepiano, organ. So this made it possible to always have a different point of view. One of the students was ill at the time of the film. But today we are happy to welcome Alexandre Blanc with us because he worked a lot with us too. There's COVID problems, you see. In these sessions, we approach the work from several angles. We studied sources, for instance, methods, Saint-Lambert, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, Marteau, Türk, Adam, Montgeroux, Kramer, Hummel, Berg, Czerny, Fétis, Moscheles. But also for the legato playing, we used Baroque works published in different places in Europe and which allowed to understand how the harmonies were held with the fingers. We used also Hummel's method. He gives in his method a lot of examples of legato playing. Studies by Kramer annotated by Beethoven, and studies by Moscheles, Opus 70, with a preface of the study, which is in fact like a small method of piano. And we could study that to develop a background of abilities and also look, for instance, the pedaling also in the studies of Moscheles. Then, in group, the students had then applied these elements to the Moscheles edition in movement of the Beethoven sonatas. And finally, the students worked on 3 different instruments available in La Fondation La Ménestrandie, namely Michael Weiss, Prague, around 1820, so a piano that Beethoven could have played with a Viennese action, the middle period of Beethoven, let's say. one piano from Sébastien Erard in Paris. It's 1860. It has a double escapement action. But what is interesting, an under-damper system, which changes a little the touch of the instrument, because we have a spring who brings the damper up, who lifts the damper up. And this piano is contemporary with the Moscheles Hallberger edition. Finally, a Carl Bechstein, Berlin, 1880. So I think you can see they are behind my back, and the Bechstein is over there. So I think you have all the elements, and we can now watch the film, what we made at the end of the project.
Un pianiste aujourd'hui n'a plus la connaissance des règles que l'on connaissait sur l'usage de la pédale au temps de Beethoven. Il faut dire qu'on ne mettait jamais la pédale tout le temps, on l'utilisait comme un registre et qu'on la mettait à des occasions bien particulières, et c'est ce que nous avons étudié. Alors le répertoire de ce projet, ce sont les sonates de Beethoven, et que nous avons interprété avec l'édition de Moscheles, la deuxième édition de Moscheles, 1858, à Stuttgart-Hallberg. Ignaz Moscheles, c'est un musicien extrêmement important, un pianiste virtuose, extrêmement doué et qui va faire une grande carrière au travers de l'Europe. Il est reconnu au fond par tous les grands musiciens de son temps, à commencer par Beethoven qui va lui demander de faire la réduction piano pour son Fidelio. Il connaîtra Mendelssohn, les parents de Mendelssohn viennent chercher Moscheles pour l'enseigner. Il sera ami de Chopin, mais également de toute l'école anglaise parce qu'il va s'établir à Londres où il rencontrera Clementi, Kramer, Kalkbrenner, enfin voilà. C'est vraiment un virtuose au cœur de l'Europe, voyageant et en contact avec tous les plus grands, j'allais dire pianistes-compositeurs de l'époque comme lui. Alors Moscheles explique bien dans la préface de son édition de 1858 qu'un des points principaux qui le pousse à refaire une nouvelle édition des sonates de Beethoven, ce sont les indications pour la pédalisation. Il se rend compte que la manière de mettre la pédale a beaucoup évolué et qu'on ne sait plus les règles qui la régissent et en même temps les beautés que peuvent créer ces mélanges harmoniques comme on voit cité dans certaines méthodes.
On a essayé de comprendre dans ce projet comment il jouait à l'époque de Moscheles, parce que lui a publié une édition des sonates de Beethoven où il rajoute, d'après ses souvenirs, les pédales et les indications que Beethoven n'avait pas mis dans son édition originale. Et nous, aujourd'hui, en tant que pianiste en 2020, on a l'habitude de travailler sur des partitions qu'on appelle urtexte, c'est-à-dire où finalement il y a une espèce de fidélité par rapport aux écritures qui confine parfois un petit peu à l'absurde, dans le sens où le problème étant que s'il n'y a rien écrit, on ne va rien faire.
Dans ce projet, ce qui était vraiment très intéressant, c'était d'aller reconstituer toute la partie non écrite, tout ce qui n'a pas été laissé sur papier, parce qu'au-delà des indications de Moscheles, on a travaillé sur beaucoup d'autres sources. Je pense à la méthode de Louis Adam, des exercices de Hummel, des études de Kramer également. Mais aussi, on est allé voir du côté des clavecinistes toutes leurs techniques, notamment au niveau du geôlier, sur lequel on a beaucoup travaillé.
Un des grands aspects de ce projet de recherche, c'est qu'en fait, lorsque vous dites à un pianiste de ne pas utiliser la pédale, ou que vous voyez une grande section où il n'y a pas de pédale, il faut que l'instrument ne sonne pas sec. Et donc c'est tout ce jeu-là qui est venu nous a montré Jovan Camarville, qu'on utilisait bien sûr déjà au XVIIIe avec le clavecin et qui est beaucoup moins naturel pour un pianiste aujourd'hui.
À vrai dire, quand Pierre m'a demandé de participer au projet, j'étais évidemment ravie, mais je me suis posé la question de savoir qu'est-ce que j'allais, en tant que claveciniste, apporter aux étudiants. Et je me suis rendu compte que les traditions d'écriture des clavecinistes qu'on utilise aujourd'hui et qu'on utilisait au XVIIe ou au XVIIIe siècle, finalement, ont perduré pendant au moins le début du XIXe. Et que ces traditions de jeux liés, de jeux articulés aussi, ont été extrêmement bien décrites dans la plupart des méthodes de piano du début du XIXe. Alors c'est ainsi que j'ai pu faire le lien entre le jeu lié des musiciens baroques et le jeu lié des pianistes.
Alors le jeu lié, c'est apprendre à tenir les harmonies avec les doigts, avoir un contrôle de chaque doigt, surtout de contrôle du relevé du doigt, puisqu'on contrôle la descente de l'étouffoir, donc la fin du son. Et si on a pris l'habitude d'utiliser la pédale, c'est le pied qui va terminer les notes, alors que là, vous devez, comme un claveciniste, comme on le faisait au XVIIIe, avoir la maîtrise de chaque doigt, de la manière, de la vitesse avec laquelle vous la relevez. Ce qui va vous donner, si vous la relevez très vite, un staccato, si vous le relevez lentement, une note qui est beaucoup plus expressive et chantante. Mais je remarque que vous avez fait beaucoup de progrès déjà dans le jeu sans pédale. Vous avez utilisé plein de petits arpègements, des choses. Non, mais
parce qu'après, avec le pédale, c'est vraiment de jouer avec la main qui s'enlève.
La première indication de jeu, quand même, c'est du legato avec les doigts. C'est là où on voit aussi que la pédale, ce n'est pas fait pour lier, mais pour créer une atmosphère, pour créer un timbre.
Pour un enseignement habituel, on va dire, on va utiliser la pédale pour qu'il n'y ait aucun trou entre les notes. Or là, le trou, on ne l'entend pas, quoi. Ça va trop vite et tu le réalises très très bien. Et dès qu'on met de la pédale, ça va vraiment empâter le discours et perdre le caractère un peu pétillant que tu décrivais. Quoi.
C'est vrai.
Ta main qui va vraiment dans les basses avec le La qui reste en résonance, pas de pédale, ça marche très bien et on a le changement de caractère quand même.
Mais si, il y a une pédale.
Absolument, mais avec tes doigts.
En tout cas, effectivement, ça donne un jeu tout d'un coup très ciselé, extrêmement polyphonique. On entend toutes les voix. Hein.
Il y avait une atmosphère vraiment de collaboration avec les profs. C'est pas seulement de montrer qu'est-ce que tu dois faire sur le piano, mais c'est vraiment une collaboration, un échange des idées.
Et c'était amusant de voir comme ils sont très bien pris au jeu et ils avaient vraiment beaucoup d'idées. Et même parfois, je veux dire, ils allaient au-delà des idées que j'aurais pu avoir, expérimentant absolument toutes les facettes du jeu lié. De même pour la pédalisation. Le réflexe est tellement fort qu'on a toujours tendance à remettre une pédale comme on le fait d'habitude. Et c'est vrai que changer ce réflexe est beaucoup plus difficile et complexe.
Très jeune, on apprend avec le pied et avec les oreilles à coordonner et à nettoyer, à faire en sorte que le son soit toujours pur et toujours net en fait.
Mais à l'inverse, on a été très surpris aussi de jouer pendant aussi longtemps sans pédale, de tout lier avec les doigts, sans avoir la petite aide du pied qui reste sur la pédale comme on a un petit peu tous appris à faire en dosant homéopathiquement, mais tout de même, non, là vraiment tout au doigt, justement pour que la pédale devienne non pas une aide ou un élément de texture sonore, tiens on va ouvrir le son de l'instrument, mais vraiment un pur effet théâtral.
Et là, vous avez fait quoi avec le pied? Vous avez vu ce qu'il a fait?
Moi, j'ai changé là sur chaque...
Pas à la toute fin.
Pas à la toute fin, mais j'ai fait plus que ce que j'aurais fait sur piano moderne, mais en même temps, j'ai nettoyé quand c'était trop. C'est-à-dire quand il y a des enchaînements harmoniques avec des basses, par exemple, quand on arrive sur la dominante, j'avais besoin d'avoir l'instrument qui soit nettoyé des résonances précédentes, parce que même si ça se mélange bien, je trouve, le début, là, je change. Là, j'ai changé tout à l'heure, parce que je trouvais que ça faisait beaucoup. Et je change de nouveau quand j'arrive sur la nouvelle tonique.
Tu as fait deux choses différentes. Quand il y avait le chant avec les sol, la, fa, tu changeais ta pédale, toutes les mesures.
Ah ouais?
Et à partir du moment où il y a le motif juste en arpège qui monte, là tu l'as gardé sur 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 mesures.
Donc, mais ouais.
Alors,
et si on suit Czerny, il faudrait changer quand même à chaque mesure, mais en même temps l'harmonie reste sur le sol.
C'est à tester. Vous avez
ouais.
déjà testé pas mal de mélanges, maintenant vous commencez à avoir un peu de... Je pense.
Mais ouais.
Oui.
Et puis ça fera aussi une différence avec le jeu moderne où là on change à chaque basse qui change, mais le jeu moderne c'est même quand la mélodie change.
C'est même au jeu moderne, on changerait même.
Et là on perd vraiment l'atmosphère du.
Ouais.
Sur ce piano, on enregistre. Vous avez essayé de le jouer avec la céleste. Ça, c'est une chose qu'on avait à l'époque de Beethoven. On peut tout à fait imaginer de mettre la pédale céleste.
Ce qui est intéressant avec Beethoven, c'est que, bon, on le sait de manière générale, mais c'est quelqu'un qui est assez à cheval entre les périodes. Et puis dans le même temps, Beethoven était quelqu'un qui regardait vers l'avenir dans son style, qu'il a dû affirmer pendant sa vie. Et c'était nouveau, sa manière de concevoir la musique et le piano. Donc c'était aussi intéressant d'avoir trois instruments de trois époques différentes, justement pour voir ce qui fonctionnait, ce qui ne fonctionnait pas, toujours en gardant à l'esprit le fait qu'il y a aussi une question de goût.
On a là trois instruments, un de l'époque de Beethoven, Michael Weiss, 1820 à Prague, Erard Paris, 1866, contemporain de l'édition, et un piano de Bechstein, fin 19e, 1899.
Quand la Haute École de musique nous a approchés pour ce projet, évidemment que ça faisait complètement sens de l'accueillir ici. Et puis c'était aussi une manière indirecte de rappeler l'existence dans les collections encyclopédiques du Musée d'art et d'histoire d'une collection d'instruments de musique. Les musées ont joué un rôle fondamental dans l'interprétation historiquement informée, et à travers la collaboration avec la Fondation de la Ménestrandi, on essaye aussi de rappeler cette vocation en organisant régulièrement des concerts.
Tout naturellement, le musée nous a accueillis pour la phase finale de ce projet qui permettait ainsi aux étudiants de jouer les trois instruments dans un cadre, j'allais dire, comme dans une salle de concert, presque, même si la salle de concert est entourée d'armes du Moyen-Âge.
les premières fois, quand il y avait des mélanges de pédales, par exemple, terribles,
tout s'est changé
on était un peu
dans notre tête.
Et maintenant, on est des ayatollahs de la pédale. S'il n'y en a pas en 4 mesures, limite, il n'y en a pas assez. Mais bon, c'est un juste milieu à trouver. Mais en tout cas, c'est essayer de retrouver ce goût-là. Et est-ce que ça fonctionne sur un piano Bechstein?
Ouais, c'est ça.
Ou est-ce qu'on est condamné, puisqu'on a un Bechstein et des Steinway et des Yamaha, à jouer dans notre style, finalement, dans notre Beethoven à nous, du XXIe siècle?
Le problème ne vient pas essentiellement du piano moderne, mais vraiment qu'on a changé notre façon de voir Beethoven, de l'interpréter, et que voilà, je préfère cette approche qu'on a trouvée en recherche. Et je suis devenu extrêmement prosélyte, et je vois que tous mes collègues sont extrêmement friands de la moindre information justement sur voilà, comment on pouvait jouer à l'époque, qu'est-ce qu'on peut ajouter à notre jeu actuel.
On a été les premiers surpris par les résultats qu'on a pu tester et les choses qui sont sorties des instruments quand on s'est retrouvé en face de l'expérimentation. Et on essaye aujourd'hui de voir si on ne peut pas adapter ces découvertes-là, ce qu'on a appris sur tout le reste en fait. sur notre pratique de pianiste au quotidien.
Dans l'édition de Moscheles, on a vraiment, pour chaque sonate, tout au long, les indications d'un choix possible. Ce que l'on comprend en utilisant, au fond, cette édition, c'est qu'il n'y a pas une vérité, et ça, c'est aussi ce que les étudiants ont compris, c'est qu'au fond, la manière de mettre la pédale doit être comprise et qu'après, à nous de jouer avec, de faire peut-être d'autres mélanges poétiques.
Alors dans cette sonate, la première chose qui m'a frappé quand j'ai pu avoir l'exemplaire de Moscheles, c'est que toutes les pédales sont indiquées, mais elles ne correspondent absolument pas à ce que j'avais l'habitude de voir dans une partition. Et de fait, c'est le but de notre travail, c'est de prendre ces exemplaires et d'essayer d'adapter au plus près de ce qui est annoté, et de voir ensuite ce qui est possible, ce qui est réalisable sur un piano ancien, comme sur un piano plus actuel. Si je joue exactement ce qui est indiqué, on va obtenir des effets de résonance qui sont normalement prohibés dans ce qui est, on va dire, l'esthétique actuelle du piano. À savoir que je vais tenir la pédale pratiquement sans interruption pendant les 4 premières mesures, en changeant une fois le pied pour être précis, là où un pianiste moderne changerait une bonne dizaine de fois le pied. Et maintenant, une version plus traditionnelle à notre époque. Voilà. Alors, entre la première version, où on obtient une atmosphère assez céleste, féerique, avec beaucoup de résonance, une espèce de sentiment un peu ouaté. La deuxième fois, on a quelque chose de beaucoup plus vertical, où certes, on n'a aucun mélange de notes, on a plus des choses comme ça, qui sont aujourd'hui un petit peu difficiles à accepter, mais on perd en fait tout ce qui fait la singularité de ce qui est indiqué dans cette partition, et peut-être aussi de ce qui fait le charme de ce mouvement de sonate. C'est vraiment qu'on a une introduction, et grâce à ces pédales, on obtient une atmosphère très différente et un très gros contraste avec le reste de la pièce. Alors le fait de respecter les pédales indiquées, ça entraîne beaucoup de difficultés techniques assez nouvelles pour un pianiste actuel, puisque je ne vais pas recenser le nombre exact des pédales indiquées, mais on a peut-être une quinzaine d'indications, là où un pianiste actuel changerait la pédale, mais peut-être plusieurs centaines de fois en fait. Donc c'est un changement complet de technique qu'on va être obligé de mettre en place. Alors un exemple assez impressionnant, c'est les accords qui se suivent. Des accords parfois très chargés avec jusqu'à 8 notes par doigt. Avec la pédale, on se pose assez peu de questions. On n'a aucun effort à faire spécial, il suffit d'appuyer, le pied fait le reste. Alors que sans le pied, ça nous oblige à penser chaque doigt qui doit essayer de se déplacer sans qu'il y ait le moindre trou, en essayant de garder une continuité de chaque ligne, et c'est beaucoup plus difficile. Typiquement ici. Et on obtient un effet beaucoup plus clair en fait dans la pièce si on ne met pas la pédale que si on l'ajoute. Il y a aussi des exemples beaucoup plus subtils de moments où en fait on peut jouer sans la pédale aussi aujourd'hui. Mais on va avoir un résultat qui va être peu convaincant, en tout cas qui va sonner un peu artificiel, un peu sec. Et donc la solution là aussi qu'on a commencé à adopter dans ce projet de recherche, c'est de faire la pédale avec les doigts, de remplacer le pied par des doigts qui vont rester enfoncés, même si ce n'est pas explicitement dit sur la partition. Là, par exemple, je garde 5 doigts enfoncés, alors que j'en aurais 2 maximum indiqués. Et ça change vraiment de la version traditionnelle qu'on jouerait aujourd'hui. Un des points aussi très importants de cette recherche, qui a été beaucoup centré sur l'utilisation de la pédale, c'est que pour un pianiste actuel, en fait, on va utiliser ce qu'on appelle une pédale syncopée, c'est-à-dire une pédale où on va changer de manière très brève le pied de façon à ce qu'il n'y ait aucune coupure entre les différents accords, entre les différentes pédales qui sont mises. Or, ce qu'on a pu constater dans les pédales de Moscheles, c'est que, alors certes, il indique très précisément le début de la pédale, mais il indique aussi très précisément la fin de la pédale, et de façon vraiment très précise. À chaque fois, on retrouve les mêmes exemples, ce ne sont pas des erreurs. Et donc, ça va entraîner le fait qu'il y aura forcément une petite césure dans le spectre harmonique, et je vais vous montrer tout de suite la différence. Premier exemple, l'utilisation actuelle, donc syncopée de la pédale. Maintenant, tel que c'est écrit sur ma partition. Voilà. Donc vous avez un jeu qui va être plus clair, on va dire, puisque voilà, on aura des harmonies plus simples à entendre, on entendra vraiment le changement. Et ça implique aussi de lier avec les doigts la main droite. C'est une technique aussi qu'on a abandonnée. Mais si je ne veux pas qu'il y ait un vrai trou dans le discours, je suis obligé de tenir 4 doigts en même temps, là où il n'y en a qu'un seul qui sera indiqué. Les indications sont faciles à comprendre pour un pianiste moderne, mais elles impliquent aussi d'adapter notre technique. Et je voulais jouer sur ce piano, qui est un piano de, s'il me semble, 1888 ou quelque chose comme ça, qui est très proche finalement d'un piano moderne par rapport à un piano forte. Et les effets de pédale qu'on peut obtenir ici ne sont pas du tout gênants. Donc en fait, c'est probablement plutôt un changement de conception, un changement d'habitude d'écoute, on va dire, qui font qu'on a abandonné un petit peu cette façon de jouer, mais en fait, ce n'est pas tellement le problème de la mécanique de l'instrument qui est en cause.
Je vais vous parler de la sonate de Beethoven, opus 10, numéro 3, en ré majeur, et nous allons plus précisément nous concentrer sur le deuxième mouvement, le mouvement lent, qui lui est en ré mineur, c'est un largo et mesto. Lorsqu'on tente l'expérience de mettre ces pédales de Moscheles, c'est une expérience assez surprenante. Mais quand on se prend au jeu, on peut se rendre compte que les pédales agissent comme un amplificateur du caractère de la pièce. Elles viennent vraiment aider à la théâtralisation des caractères qui se succèdent au fil de la pièce. Ce phénomène-là est remarquable dès le début, où on a une alternance entre 2 pédales longues et puis un passage de plusieurs mesures où on n'a plus aucune indication de pédale. Je vais vous jouer d'abord ce que j'aurais fait spontanément avec le pied moderne correspondant à ma formation, et ensuite avec les indications de Moscheles. Là, j'ai eu le pied très actif. J'ai énormément changé la pédale pour éviter des mélanges harmoniques, éviter de laisser se rencontrer des notes qui ne sont pas supposées se rencontrer, comme par exemple le Ré et le Do dièse. On souhaite éviter qu'ils se rencontrent. Mais là, je vais vous jouer la version avec les pédales de Moscheles et vous aurez un résultat très différent, beaucoup plus de mélange. Les 2 dernières mesures, là, avec les pédales de Moscheles sont faites entièrement liées avec les doigts. La pédale n'est plus un procédé de facilitation, c'est un procédé d'amplification du caractère. Elle est vraiment conçue comme un jeu, comme un effet de registration. Et là, avec ce mélange très surprenant pour une conception moderne, moi je trouve que ça se marie tout à fait bien avec l'indication de caractère qui donne beaucoup de tristesse, d'incertitude, voire d'angoisse.
Alors moi je joue la sonate plus 14 numéro 2 de Beethoven, qui est une sonate qui à première vue paraît un peu plus juvénile chez Beethoven parce qu'elle a un style très classique, très galant, alors qu'en fait c'est surprenant de se rendre compte qu'elle est exactement contemporaine à la grande sonate pathétique. Et du coup, par rapport à ce projet de recherche, ce qu'on peut constater, c'est que les traits très galants, comme ça, on peut tout à fait appliquer ce qu'on voit dans certains traités, notamment le traité de Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, dans lequel il est précisé comment il faut jouer le jeu lié, et notamment un jeu, si j'ose dire, un peu de triche, où on enlève une note pour pouvoir, quand on a deux voix dans une main, pour pouvoir faire en sorte que ça sorte mieux. Donc si je vous joue tel que c'est écrit dans un extrait de mon premier mouvement de cette sonate, c'est écrit donc à deux voix. Donc le problème, c'est que le soprano fait fa, si, la, sol, et le mezzo fait, enfin l'alto, pardon, fait. Donc en fait, il y a une note commune, un croisement, et du coup, au lieu de jouer tout, qui nous casse notre legato, on va simplement faire laisser résonner le soprano, qui devient en fait la note d'alto. Voilà, et ça sonne beaucoup mieux du coup.
Le jeu lié, il est intéressant dans ce mouvement parce que, contrairement à ce qu'on a vu avec mes camarades ou avec d'autres exemples, avec un jeu harmonique où on tient les notes quand on a une même harmonie, ce qu'on peut voir d'ailleurs dans le premier mouvement de cette même sonate où on a ce genre de choses. J'ai une même harmonie, donc je tiens. Et ainsi de suite. Ici, on va avoir un contrepoint qui se dessine dans le jeu lié. C'est-à-dire, je vais jouer ce que je lis sur la partition de manière exacte. Le thème, c'est cela. Maintenant, si on tient en compte les propos donc, du contexte de la vie de Beethoven, c'est-à-dire Hummel, Kramer, Czerny, on obtient un motif à deux voix. Ça va être la même chose pour la main gauche, d'ailleurs, puisque le thème va arriver à la main gauche. Alors c'est sûr que ça complexifie un peu la tâche du pianiste, puisqu'il doit faire attention à plusieurs voix d'un coup et à soigner ces deux voix, mais ça rend aussi l'œuvre beaucoup plus riche. Et donc la fameuse notion de Czerny, c'est une sonate à la Kramer, ça ne rend pas cette sonate comme un exercice de technique, puisque c'est un peu à ça qu'on les a réduits malheureusement, ces compositeurs, mais à une technique, à un goût, un style de jeu de l'époque. Dans ce mouvement, Moscheles indique des pédales pour deux types d'exemples, pour deux types de situations. La première est celle qu'on retrouve dans beaucoup de traités, qui est celle dans des batteries dans le grave, que voici. Si je fais sans pédale, et maintenant, Moscheles demande avec pédale, pour faire un effet saisissant de tumulte, d'orage, quelque chose d'assez volcanique. Et La deuxième utilisation de la pédale se retrouve lorsque on reste sur la même harmonie pendant, dans ce cas-là, 10 mesures, donc pendant en tout cas plusieurs mesures. À la fin du morceau, Moscheles nous demande de garder la même pédale sur 10 mesures, puisque l'on garde la même harmonie, ce qui donne ceci. Cependant, ce n'est pas systématique non plus, puisque ce motif-là est apparu dans le morceau précédemment, et Moscheles nous indiquait la même chose, donc une harmonie qui tient durant 10 mesures, avec les mêmes motifs, mais sans pédale. C'est-à-dire que ce qui est important, c'est de varier les touchés et de varier les effets de registre.
Pour ma part, je me suis intéressé à la sonate numéro 15 en Ré majeur, opus 28, qui est un peu le jalon entre les sonates de jeunesse et les sonates de la maturité, puisqu'on est en gros à mi-parcours dans l'œuvre de Beethoven. Et c'est une sonate qui a, comme beaucoup d'autres, un surnom, qui est le surnom de la pastorale. C'est une sonate qui a été composée en 1801, et au tout début du 19e siècle, on connaît la pastorale comme un genre très populaire, très codifié, qui fait référence à un sujet de caractère bucolique, qui évoque la nature. Donc Louis Adam, qui était un des fondateurs de l'école moderne du pianoforte au début du 19e siècle en France, écrit dans sa méthode un chapitre entier qui est consacré à l'usage des pédales. Et il nous dit une phrase intéressante à un moment. « Il ne faut se servir de cette pédale et de cette manière de jouer doux que pour les chants purs dont les sons peuvent se soutenir longtemps, comme par exemple dans les pastorales et musettes. » Et donc, chose encore plus intéressante, il écrit une pastorale dans la méthode, où il note très précisément l'usage de la pédale qu'il préconise pour cette musique-là. Donc je vais vous jouer le début de cette pastorale. Voilà, donc on entend bien dans cette petite pièce de Louis Adam que ça ne dérange pas du tout à l'époque les auditeurs de mélanger les harmonies de tonique et de dominance qui aujourd'hui n'est plus du tout dans les usages. Et ça nous a amené à une réflexion sur justement les codes et les usages qui pouvaient être en vigueur à l'époque de Beethoven ou de Moscheles. Là où Beethoven est génial, c'est qu'il joue avec ses codes à chaque fois. Donc il ne va pas forcément en faire l'usage qu'on attend de lui. Typiquement, dans le final de la pastorale, Moscheles nous indique pas de pédale sur le début, alors que contrairement à ce que suggère Louis Adam, on serait tenté d'en mettre, et plutôt beaucoup que pas du tout. Donc là, il a fallu un petit peu trouver des solutions. Et donc, je vais vous jouer le tout début de ce final pour qu'on entende cette basse de cornemuse, de musette qui évoque la nature. Donc ça fait... Voilà le thème du final. Et quand je l'ai déjà joué sur piano moderne, je mettais la pédale d'une manière totalement conventionnelle, c'est-à-dire je la change sur chaque note. Et du coup, pour retrouver cet effet-là, il faut tenir les notes qui ne sont pas écrites. Pour évoquer la cornemuse. Mais on va complètement à l'encontre de ce qui est écrit dans la partition, puisqu'il y a écrit croche noire, croche noire, croche noire. On n'est pas censé tenir la croche. Pourtant, quand on le fait, on voit bien que ça évoque tout de suite une vielle à roue ou une cornemuse, quelque instrument des bergers ou du pastoralisme. Et c'était un point intéressant de travailler dans ce final, cette technique de jeu lié à l'imitation de la pédale, mais sans la pédale. Au contraire, dans le premier mouvement, ça va être une orgie de pédales, avec des mélanges qui étaient vraiment choquants pour nos oreilles au début. On est dans la même atmosphère un petit peu de rêve et de brume du matin. Et Beethoven nous introduit cette sonate en retardant le plus possible l'arrivée de la tonique, de Ré majeur, de l'accord principal, puisque pendant 27 mesures, on va avoir un Ré basse qui va se répéter, mais au-dessus, il va se passer tellement de choses étranges et différentes de ce qui était attendu par les contemporains de Beethoven quand ils écoutaient une pastorale, que ça a fait dire à un critique de l'époque que c'était une des choses les plus étranges qui lui avait été donné d'entendre.
Qu'est-ce que j'ai trouvé de nouveau avec cette sonate, avec l'édition de Moscheles, c'est qu'en fait la pédale ici devient un moyen pour rendre ces différences d'atmosphère, de couleurs, donc des contrastes aussi de sonorité. Un exemple très important dans cette sonate, dans le sens du pédale et du changement du goût en plus, c'est le grand récitatif qu'il y a tout au début de la réexposition. Et donc ça, c'est l'édition, ça, c'est la version par Beethoven. Donc on voit qu'il y a cette très, très particulière atmosphère, très particulière couleur. Moscheles, il a changé complètement d'idée parce que, bon, aussi pour le changement de l'instrument, mais peut-être aussi pour le changement du goût, il a décidé de couper la pédale jusqu'après l'harmonie de la majeure. Ça, c'est la version par Moscheles, donc avec la pédale coupée. Vous voyez qu'il change complètement d'articulation. Ça devient vraiment théâtral, plus récitatif dans le vrai sens du mot. Après, qu'est-ce qu'on a vu vraiment beaucoup dans ce travail, c'est la pratique du jeu lié que j'ai dû beaucoup appliquer sur cette sonate. En fait, il y a vraiment beaucoup des exemples que je peux prendre, mais je pense que le plus frappant, c'est lequel on cherche vraiment de reconstruire une mélodie. Et c'est juste avant la réexposition. Et ça, c'est... bon, avant, je pouvais jouer ça dans ces manières-là. Après, qu'est-ce qu'on a vu dans les traités anciens? C'est qu'en fait, on doit, quand il est possible, on doit tenir, on doit garder les harmonies avec le doigt, aussi pour faire sortir les mélodies qui sont dedans le même harmonie. Donc, ce passage, je l'ai vu après, je l'ai fait lentement maintenant pour vous montrer qu'est-ce que j'ai fait. Tiens.
Bravo, bravo, Pierre, and to all of your students. That was just such a rich and informative, inspiring presentation. I learned so much. I especially enjoyed the interaction and the curiosity and genuineness of your search for great Beethoven performance. And you are all such wonderful performers that we could hear exactly what you were talking about in your comparisons and examples. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Now, before we go into our Q&A, and for the Q&A, please, as audience members, type in questions that you have for Pierre and his students, as well as for our panelists, or points of discussion that you'd like to see discussed now. Type it into your chat box, and we will try to answer as many of those as we can. I just want to let you know that our next salon will be called Women, Some Men, Salons and Pianos, and it's going to be a wonderful program on women composers with women pianists throughout history and now. That's going to be April 24th, Saturday, April 24th at 2 p.m. New York City time. So we hope you'll join us for that and stay posted for announcements. So now to our Q&A. Maria, would you like to start us off?
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to add, it's from, and it's going to be hosted from Florence, from the Bartolomeo Cristofori collection in the next one. So that's an added benefit. And yes, well, welcome all of you. It's a great opportunity to, and I think we probably could spend 5 hours discussing all the, there was so much information in there, and I was so impressed with how everybody was focused and really had something important to say. So and I think I'd like to ask one question, and there's no good answer for it, but I think it kind of gets to the heart of what we're all doing and thinking about. So my question is that Moscheles, in his preface, he does say that the newer pianos allow for more effects, and that we should not avoid them, but they should also not deviate too much from tradition, which by that he means the way Beethoven and his contemporaries would have played them 40 years earlier. And then he basically says, well, I knew Beethoven so well that I can tell you what is in that tradition and what is not play in the tradition. So my question is, do you see Moscheles more as a modern pianist trying to reconcile the instrument with the style of Beethoven, or do you see him as a source of original information? Do you see him more as a modern pianist, playing Beethoven in the right tradition and the right sense of style, but on a modern piano? Or do you see him as somebody who really wants to share knowledge of how Beethoven was played 40 years earlier. So I think he's kind of straddling that, and I'm not sure there's a good answer, but that would be my question. Is he, to what extent is he a modern pianist in his approach?
Maybe I could kick off by not exactly answering the question, but maybe expanding it. But first of all, before I say anything else, I just say thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I think it's just great, fantastic what you're doing, and you know, internet we've all had to rely on during a difficult time, but there are some real virtues to it. So thank you. I think what your question, Maria, really addresses, and what the whole event addresses, is this fundamental question for 19th century pianists, which is, how do you play earlier music on the current pianos, the pianos of the mid-19th century? And I suppose the first thing to say about that is that we have to remember that the technology of piano making was expanding so quickly. It's hard for us to realize, because we've been used to what pianos sound like. You know, we know from birth what they sound like, but it's I was thinking about modern equivalents. You think about the motor car, you think about the telephone, and so on. You know, if somebody's using a telephone that's 10 years old these days, everyone just laughs. Well, that's a kind of equivalent to what was going on in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. A 10-year-old piano would seem terribly out of date. Things are moving so quickly. So how do you keep abreast of that? One little intriguing example, I think, of how the problem gets answered is looking at Clementi's sonatas. Clementi just revised and revised, and I'm thinking in particular of one work is Opus 2 sonatas, which when he first played them in public, I think would have been on a harpsichord, but he republished them, he revised them, and over a period of about 40 years. And as he does that, you gradually see the legato slurs becoming longer. You see a little bit of pedaling creeping in. He's modernizing. And there's a real example of somebody who knew that in his own works, they needed to be modernized. But then the question arises, I think, how far do you go? And I was thinking about the second quarter of the 19th century. You got two very different trends. If you're in Paris, for example, you've got a culture that says you go a long way. You know, you take an older piece, you play it on the new range of the pianos, you add notes at the top and bottom. You use the modern resonance of those new pianos. You've got no shame in doing this. You maybe add a few bars here and there as well. It was a very extravagant culture. So you got that on the one side. On the other side, you got this new idea of the Werktreu, the idea that you stick as closely as possible to the composer's wish, the composer's notation. And so editors become very, very careful in trying to reflect in their editions exactly what the composer wrote. Czerny, for example, in his comments on Beethoven Sonata, says, you know, you've absolutely got to stick to what the composer wrote. Don't add anything to it. Probably because he got his fingers wrapped. Because when he started adding notes at the top of the keyboard, Beethoven said, "No, you can't do that." Beethoven probably said it less politely than that. So you got these two opposing trends. So part of the answer to your question, Maria, you know, how do we follow Moscheles? Well, Moscheles, to my mind, sits somewhere towards the conservative end of that tradition. He tries to be faithful to Beethoven, but he realizes, I think like Czerny did, you've got to do a certain amount of modernization because of the big resonance that was emerging on these pianos. But I do believe actually that the same question remains for modern pianists as well. And perhaps the problem is even more extreme than it was for Moscheles.
I was going to ask the pianists themselves how they felt if they were going to play the sonatas they've been working on in a concert now on one of these appropriate pianos. Would they follow Moscheles? What would they do? How would they find their middle point?
I don't know whether we're going to, are the students interested in responding right now?
I don't know.
Pierre?
Anna is going to answer.
Yes, I can reply. I think actually it's kind of a difficult question because in one sense, we kind of learned that also the flavor, I would say, changed. So it's what Moscheles did was, in one hand, he tried to be as faithful to Beethoven's music as possible. Yeah, sorry, I was looking at the wrong side. But at the same time, he tried to accomplish the changement of ideas, of musical ideas of the moment. So I would say that I would do a sort of mixture of Beethoven's ideas, Moscheles' ideas, and I would say my ideas also, because I would say that also it's nice and it's new also to see how things works on a modern piano. So and also I would change my way of playing in order of the piano I am using. So for example, on a modern piano, I would do something that is more I would say near to Moscheles' ideas, but on an ancient one, maybe ideas that are nearer to Beethoven's ideas. But I would say it's always a research, a new way of thinking every time I'm playing it.
Thank you very much.
You know, if I could just say, I guess my turn also to thank everybody, Yiheng and Maria, for making this possible, and Pierre for sharing your project. First of all, one of the things that struck me was because you were using the pianos of 3 different eras, I actually thought that in some way you tilted the discourse away from the instruments themselves and concentrated on interpretation directly in a way that you could say are the questions that have to be addressed no matter what piano you're playing on. And I must say that that's something very dear to my own heart. In my teaching at Oberlin, I mostly am teaching the fortepiano as a secondary instrument to regular pianists. And as some of you know, I've just published a book, the subtitle of which is What Modern Pianists Can Learn from Period Instruments. I mean, my feeling is that for too many people, not really anybody, certainly in the room right here, but for too many people, old pianos and performance practice are sort of specialized topics that can be left to specialists, and that everybody else just carries on with business as usual. And so I'm really happy to see that as a part of this project that you were moving among pianos of these different eras. Another thought that occurred to me, and partly in response to David Rowland's point about what was going on in the 19th century and the way the pianos were changing, a favorite point of reference for me is the Beethoven Concerto Opus 19. Maybe some of you know where I am going with this story, that this was an early piece that he composed for a 5-octave fortepiano. And then considerably later, there was a performance in sight, I think, for his student, and he composed a cadenza. And the new cadenza is unplayable on the piano for which the concerto was written, from which it's obvious to infer that Beethoven planned for that concerto, the early concerto, to be played on a later piano, right? Now, we today would say, oh my goodness, I'm playing Opus 19, got to find a really good 5-octave piano. And obviously, this was not what Beethoven thought. Beethoven thought, no, of course, it would have been easier for him to find one, after all, than for most of us today. So I think that our use of these older instruments is very much to do with a kind of research way of, I sometimes call it the time machine. You know, we're trying to put ourselves into the past, and that Beethoven didn't have this problem, because he had an intimate knowledge of how that music is supposed to go in a way that we're always looking for every hint we can get. And I just wanted to throw one other thing out, that this project is very complicated in a way because there's a middleman, right? Here we are in the 21st century, and then we have Beethoven back in the past, and we have Moscheles in the middle, kind of mediating. I'm really, really interested in these exact same questions in Chopin. And Chopin puts even as much specific information about pedaling as Moscheles, maybe more. I don't know. Every page of Chopin is covered, and I'm wondering whether the students have had any opportunity or encouragement to try Chopin's indications with the same scrupulousness as you've done here.
I bet they have, because I know Pierre is well versed in Chopin.
Yes, about Chopin, we worked on the trois nouvelles études on the method with Fetis and Moscheles, and so I decided to play the three etudes. And there is a big problem in the number 2 in A flat major, where there's no pedal at all marked in the score. And playing that study without any pedal is quite a challenge, and I haven't heard no version of this etude played as written in the score, so it's quite interesting. And in the first one in F minor, we have a lot of pedal. Every bar is marked with pedal, and we also have to deal with very light left hand in order to keep the melody of the right hand clear, but at the same time mixed with all the chromatics, and that's really interesting, because in these three studies Chopin focuses on what really matters for pianists, like legato, voicing, and rubato. So yes, we are in the same line of thinking, and Moscheles is kind of link between Beethoven and Chopin for me. We know that they played together, they were friends, they were in the same social groups, so ideas can be transmitted, and there is no gap for me. We often think that there is a clear gap in the early 19th century, and after 1830, maybe things completely changed, and not completely in my mind.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful perspective, and I'm going to run and look at Moscheles editions of Chopin for sure. We have a question from one of our audience members for any of our panelists or any of Pierre's students and Pierre himself. A question from Peter Takash, who is a professor of piano at Oberlin Conservatory. He asks, how do you reconcile Czerny and Moscheles on the Beethoven Opus 31 number 2 recitatives?
The Tempest. Yeah.
The Tempest.
It's
yeah, sorry, I wasn't sure. Sandra's going to talk, she?
But I think that's a situation where you can do it very well on a modern piano, holding the pedal completely through the recitative. And you can do it on all these other pianos as well. So it's a choice, but it's a choice, I think, that goes against Beethoven. I think Beethoven was well aware of what he was doing there. And had he not wanted pedal in the second part of the recitative, he would have shortened the pedal. So I think that's a place where maybe Moscheles wasn't remembering very well or wasn't really thinking about Beethoven.
Is it Beethoven's pedaling or Czerny?
Well, I think Beethoven's pedaling is just straight through the passage.
Yeah. Right. That's how I've always. Yeah, I found it actually the most surprising pedal marking in that came across from and a very, very surprising one.
The first time I heard it was when Arthur Schnabel played that sonata, and I had never heard pedaling like that. I ran home to my music and looked at the spot. And of course, he went right straight through.
Could I give a couple of observations on it? I think the trouble is that both Czerny and Moscheles are playing on pianos that don't replicate the effect that it would have had on Beethoven's piano when he first wrote it and published it. So that's the nature of the problem, I think. And it seems to me, I can't remember the name of the student who played it, but one thing that occurred to me when she did play it was there are implications for the tempo. The more resonant the piano gets, then the slower you are probably going to tend to play that recitative. So if you're going to hold the pedal down all the time, there's a knock-on effect, I suspect, for the tempo of the recitative. Or you compromise in a way that perhaps Moscheles might have done.
Well, you can manipulate the pedal by the time you get that far along in the development of the piano. That's the answer, I think.
Yeah.
It looked like Pierre wanted to add to this.
I would just have to add something. This is a very special point, this recitative. And I had a chance to look to the first edition of Moscheles. And the interesting thing is that he cut not completely pedal as he did in the last one. He just starting in the drama edition. He shortened both, especially the second one. And in the Hallberger edition, he just cut them very completely and without pedal, cut the pedal. So it's just as he made a change between these two editions. And I found that very, very interesting. So it could be a question of taste when we think that Czerny says in the third concerto, the second movement, you have to, nowadays, say Czerny, you can't keep the pedal so long, but you have to change it in the middle. So probably with the instrument increasing in sound, they felt you need to change the pedal. Or just, as Sandra said, just again, Beethoven, a new idea, but I think they were not sure. The idea of having another idea than the composer, why not? If it's a nice idea, why not? If it's coherent with a discourse, musical discourse. It's why I insisted that we had that in this project.
Yeah. Right.
And this is really an interesting point.
Sure. Ian, can we get the sound turned up a little?
Okay, Sarah. Yes, Sarah will take care of that for us. Okay, and Peter Takash, thank you. Peter is just reminding us that Czerny says of this passage, it should sound as if coming from a cave. So that's a wonderful idea to keep in mind, given whatever piano you have in front of you and looking at these various editions. Yeah.
One other point I wanted to make about, I was thinking about it in the connection with the one of the Nouvelle Etude that doesn't have any pedal markings at all. Now, this is maybe a notational question, but and maybe this is a cheating way of thinking about it. But for instance, if we look at Beethoven's pedal indications, I think pretty much everybody agrees that the indications that he puts, well, Czerny says the indications that are printed are not the full use of the pedal that he did. And so I wonder whether the same principle might be true for Chopin, where I think there's certain pages and certain pieces that look like they've been pedaled, very carefully. I mean, like the etudes that have lots of fingerings too. But for instance, the second ballade, I think, has one pedal marking or two in the entire piece. And this is a piece that has, legato slurs that are drawn over line after line of music. And I've just assumed that one of the possible ways to read this is that there are some pages that Chopin leaves us on our own, and that doesn't mean these are pages which must be played with no pedal.
Sandra, do you want to respond to Chopin?
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And I think there you have a situation of what piano you're using, the venue, and the effect you want to produce as to how much pedaling you add or don't. Chopin, it's odd when you find that extent of unpedaled music in Chopin, but it happens.
I wonder if the same is true for the Moscheles edition of Beethoven, because there are so many places that one wonders. I mean, he claims to add the pedal where Beethoven did not mark it, but it seems to me there are many places where we assume it would have been used that he does not mark. Or do you think he was very exact about his pedal markings?
Well, I think both things. The only sonata that I looked at pedaled by Moscheles was Opus 2, number 1. And I have questions about where he did and didn't pedal, and the use in the opening of the second movement, very early on, he pedals in a passage where you can easily play it legato, and it doesn't. I think he wanted to contrast those 8 measures with the ones before. And I don't necessarily think that that's where I would contrast that. But I have more questions about what he did in the 4th movement.
Yeah, I looked at that too. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah. No, I like I said, I thought a couple of times, oh really? At some spots, and I can't help but think all the time. And one of the remarks from the students that really stayed with me, and I forget exactly who it was, but that at the end of the day, it's really your approach that changes, and not so much on some level it doesn't even matter on which instrument you play it. I mean, of course, we are taught by the instruments, but that on a certain level you become aware of the mindset of looking at music in a certain way, and that I found very a very thoughtful remark, and because I think that's very true.
I have a question for perhaps one of Pierre's students, or Pierre, which is about the use of finger legato and arpeggiation, both of which I very much admired, the way that you took those 2 techniques very far in bringing out music in a way I've never heard before. What advice or ways would you give to a modern pianist or a general keyboardist in training finger legato or using arpeggiation, either on a modern piano or forte piano? How can we apply it more, and where? And how do we develop that in our regular practice of piano and Beethoven and this repertoire?
Start with the harpsichord.
Right.
Or for taking your foot off the pedal.
Or the
You're here.
clavichord.
But everything's okay. About this technique, I would say it's not that difficult because one, it's explained to you. You're starting to see occasions everywhere. Everywhere you have a chord, a broken chord, an arpeggio, you have an occasion to do it. And our teacher often says you have to smell the things. You have to smell it. Look for it like a hunting dog, and then you will find it. It's under your nose. And it's the same process. I think you might want to apply to start digging into this technique. You just have uh, to smell it. You will see it everywhere. You have broken chords everywhere in classical music, and then the habit comes really fast to your fingers. It's stunning because, in fact, I found it really enhancing my memorization and also my technique itself because it gave to my fingers the sense of where they were going. I was seeing in advance where I was going once I started applying this technique. So it's like you put your fingers uh, in something and you get trapped because it's so easy to start and to get going. So I would say you have to experiment it and you do it on a few pages and then you get it really fast. And I am teaching myself to children and teenagers, and you can teach it to first-year pianists. Really, first broken chord they have in a little piece for children, and you show them, oh, you might want to try to keep the notes under your fingers so that you're more secure. Try it, and then they are, oh yeah, okay, no problem doing that, because they don't have the same complex as we do when trying something new. And yeah, I would say try it.
Thank you.
I'd like to add one thing. I always find with teaching students that, especially with Chopin, that the note that's held by the finger is so much more expressive and beautiful than the one note that's held by the pedal, because everything is kind of reverberating all over the place with it. And that for a real melody, a clear tone, the note that's held by finger legato is much more beautiful.
Could I come here too as well? I was very interested in watching students playing with finger legato, and noticed, which is kind of obvious, I think, and I wondered if they'd noticed that when you're playing with that sort of technique, your fingers are just so much closer to the keys, and you're kind of caressing the keys, and it reminded me very much of harpsichord organ technique. I mean, I'm an organist first, then harpsichordist, then early pianist, and I hardly ever play the modern piano. So that's where I'm coming from. But first of all, as an organist, which a lot of these early 18th century other keyboard players were, you get attuned to listening very hard to both ends of the note. The release is as important as the attack, and it just becomes part of your technique, as it does on the harpsichord, clavichord. But the organ, it's particularly important, obviously, because the sound is continuous until you release it. I was also thinking, as I was watching students play, about that wonderful description of Handel's playing, that it was something like scarcely the fingers, no movement, and scarcely the fingers themselves could be discovered. You know, they're very, very quiet position on the keys. Now, what I'd be interested in other people's views on is that as you go through the 19th century, of course, the depth of the key, the depth of the key fall becomes much greater. And I find it very difficult to play on a modern piano for that very reason, because somehow or other, the sort of caressing of the fingers, where you might play successive notes with the same finger even, that just becomes so much more difficult. And somehow or other, you just kind of feel like, well, I'm going to have to use the pedal because I can't do this so easily as I can on an early keyboard. But I'd be interested in other people's perspectives on that.
Yeah, I come from the other end of the training, David, in that I started as a modern pianist and was trained in a very standard way to play from the body and the arm, to use as much weight as possible to get this powerful sound out of a modern piano. So happily, as I became exposed to earlier instruments, early and earlier, fortepianos to clavichords to harpsichords, my education in le toucher, the touch, opened up, and the sensitivity to touch and to finger legato was a wonderful chapter of my learning as a keyboardist. So, yeah, that's why I wanted to share about that.
I think I was just looking at the treaties, 19th century treaties. It seems that that approach to playing begins to disappear in the second quarter of the 19th century. By the middle of the century, it's a matter of some debate as to whether it's appropriate or not. But all this is contemporary with key depth, key fall becoming greater. I think the two must be connected.
Yeah, I think absolutely, because on a modern piano, the key depth is, and the weight of the key is so much greater. It's like 5 times more than Mozart's piano, the weight, that you cannot just play with your fingers. You'll injure yourself on a modern piano just using the caress of the fingers, or you'll get no sound. So we lost the technique of the more on the closer level of the finger touch, and being sensitive to the beginnings and the ends of the notes, as you said.
I've been playing a little Mendelssohn recently, and most of his pieces are in the second quarter of the 19th century. And I find that he phrases, or let's say he slurs like Mozart, very distinctly and with short and long slurs. And, oh, what's that? We're getting background noise. I find that to follow his articulation, I have to use 3 aspects of the old-fashioned kind of fingering. I slide from note to note. I put a short under a long, and I frequently change fingers silently. So those things are still, at least in his music. Now, he tends to be on the conservative end of things. So the change, you leave those kinds of techniques behind only very gradually.
It looks like there's someone in Geneva who wants to speak.
Yeah. Thank you. I just to add something. Mathilde has already said a lot of things, but for me, it's important also to understand the music from another way, because when you think the whole notes harmonically, you stop singing it like a melody. And for a long time, I dislike Beethoven's sonatas because of that. I thought the all was synced, and when Pierre teach me that it's a music more harmonical, I understood the meaning of holding the notes in my
practicing.
Someone else. Sorry. Yes. Okay. About the weight of the key. If you consider that, okay, you said you were an organist, but if you consider that playing Franck or Symphonie de Vierne on the cavaille école is very, very difficult too, with the weight. If you add accouplement, I don't know the English word, but accouplement, no? Coupling, if you add coupling, it's very, very heavy to play on an organ, a 19th century organ. But the organist still continues with this legato playing that pianists seems to forget at this period. So I don't think it's very correlated that the weight of the key changes the technique absolutely. About the legato, and it's very, we see that even techniques like the note commune, the common notes of the Beethoven sonata of Quentin, who played it to bound the notes themselves in the same chord. We see it tel quel, as itself, in the note commune of César Franck and all the French organ playing of the late 19th century. So there is, I don't think it's very, I'm sorry, my English is very bad, it's very late. So I don't think it's very correlated, like the weight of the key changing all the technique. It's difficult, it's more difficult, but c'est la vie.
Just very quickly, I think that's a very interesting observation. And as you were describing it, I mean, I've played organs like that, very, very heavy touch, and it's exhausting. I would say that what you tend to do on organs like that is more finger substitution than you would on a lighter action. But I'd have to think a bit more about that. A good point.
Yeah, in this context, I think it's also interesting to look at the per engramel, the notation, which is really for French organists, I think, and because it indicates very precisely in his notation not only when to play the note but also when to lift the finger, and it gives you a very good the silence d'articulation that he puts in the score, and it really shows you what they would do if they were not there, that they would not lift up their fingers most likely, and it instructs exactly how to create space between the notes, which I guess is not a natural thing for French organists.
I think David Brightman wants to speak, and then Jovanka, we will go to you next.
Great, thanks. We've been talking a lot about legato, and now that the topic of the beginning and the ends of the notes has come up, I think maybe non-legato notes is also a topic. Coming back to the Moscheles edition, those of us not in Geneva have only been able to dig up the score of Opus 2 number 1, and so we've been looking at it. So I've been looking at the last movement and comparing it with the first edition. And in the first edition, it's very interesting. I have it right here. The first 3 chords, 2 of them have a very clearly engraved dot, and the third one has nothing. And then there are 3 wedges on the next 3, which are the forte chords. So it's dot, dot, nothing, and then wedge, 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 and then nothing. And it's very, very perhaps inconsistent, but pretty interesting and stimulating to think about it. And in Moscheles' edition, all the chords have the same wedges for the first, I don't know, the first 8 bars or so, and then quit. And I'm just always disappointed, I have to say, when it looks like editors and players are not curious about the variety in the lengths of non-legato notes.
Thank you, David. Jovanka?
Something about the use of the over legato for harpsichordists. It's very obvious to use over legato and many articulations. But at the beginning of the research, it seemed to be something very special for the students. And so I had perhaps to convince them. And I brought them a lot of different proofs from the 17th and 18th century, for example. And we could observe that all the use of the over legato was connected, of course, with the harmony, like Alexandre told us. And also, it's also connected with the polyphony. And with holding some notes, we can show a hidden polyphony. And of course, it doesn't mean that we don't articulate. On the contrary, it's a sort of mixture with many articulations and also very legato and over legato.
Yeah, this is also in the Louis Adam method, the overlapping legato. I think he gives the examples of that.
Yes, but I think it's we have many quotes, very clear quotes about it. It's not by chance that we hold some notes. It's really in some special places. And perhaps the risk is to overuse the over legato.
Okay, we're almost a half an hour after when we thought we would finish, but I think this is very worthwhile. But I'm happy to keep going because I'm so happy to have such wonderful people here. If anybody wants to add anything.
Yeah, any final closing remarks for this session from any of you? Thank you so much. This has just been most rich time together. Pierre?
You're mute.
I start again. Sorry. The effect of on the students, I realized that we could think, oh, it's too deep into the text, and the more deeper we get in the practice of legato playing, the use of the more we study the sources, the more creative they began to think, and when they started that they could use the pedal as a way of making poetic mixing and also variating the text. They began to be very creative. So I think what I could observe from behind is a fantastic motion, that impulse that they receive from these results.
And liberation. Oh.
Well, I think that's a good way to end. Speaking of technology, a good old-fashioned ring of the telephone.
Yeah.
And all of these beautiful.
That was not
okay.
a telephone. No.
Wonderful, amazing musicians and thought intellects here coming together in this time of deprivation and isolation, yet we're able to come together and share our love of music and come to greater freedom as we come to more specificity of research and inquiry. So very special moment for me here. And thank you to our wonderful panelists and to Pierre and your students and to Jovanka in Switzerland for such a beautiful presentation. Now to those of us in our audience, we are still having the Zoom reception where you bring your own cup of tea or beer. And one day we'll all meet together and have a real drink together. But the Zoom link is in your chat box in the YouTube or Facebook. And just a brief way to say hello to one another and introduce yourselves in person on the Zoom platform, because on the StreamYard platform, we can't have all of you show your faces, but we would be happy to meet you there. Thank you again. Please join us for the 4th Salon on April 24th.
I have one more little remark for the panelists, because I think we touched on so many really interesting ideas, and all of this is being recorded, so it would be easy to revisit. And I would like to think about how we can maybe put some of the ideas on paper and put them together and maybe share them with the rest of the world.
Sounds good. Perhaps on our website, Academy Fortepiano. But yes, this was a very rich discussion and we could go on forever. So let's stay in touch and put some of this on paper and continue the discussion.
And thank you all in Geneva. You did it.
Yes.
We're really fighting for a whole new ideas. Thank you.